When it came to racing games, the original PlayStation had speed aficionados hooked. Gran Turismo, Need for Speed, Ridge Racer, and many more provided players with plentiful hours of breakneck entertainment behind digital steering wheels. Among these games, however, was a decidedly different experience from Newcastle-based developer Reflections Interactive, Driver. Focusing more on emulating the thrill of Hollywood-style car chases than on pure racing, the game allowed players to unleash their inner Steve McQueen across the United States' roughest roads. Driver was immensely successful and quickly spawned an ambitious yet inferior sequel that allowed players to exit and hijack cars in a 3D environment, nearly a year before Rockstar let players do the same in Grand Theft Auto 3. However, the subsequent popularity and quality of the Grand Theft Auto games would prove to be an albatross around Driver's neck. Unable to escape the former series' transcendental design, Reflections would gradually inject more and more of GTA's open-world trappings into Driver, leading to some major embarrassments and a gradual loss of the franchise's identity. Finally, after switching multiple publishers and coming to terms with Driver's strengths, Reflections would transition the series back into pure car-chasing action with 2011's Driver San Francisco. The cost of doing so left the studio uninterested in continuing the series, but resulted in an immensely entertaining experience, one that righted its predecessor's wrongs, while offering clever new ideas that helped release it from Grand Theft Auto's shadow. This is the rise and fall of Driver.
Hi, this is Douglas C. Perry, Editor-in-Chief of IGN PS2, and I'm here with Martin Edmondson, Development Director for Reflections.
Reflections was established in July of 1984 by Martin Edmondson. The English studio developed a string of minor hits before striking widespread success in 1989 with the release of Shadow of the Beast, a challenging sprite-based platformer for the Amiga, best remembered for its atmospheric soundtrack and high-quality graphics. Reflections would follow Shadow of the Beast up with a smattering of sequels and other 2D titles before making the jump to 3D with Destruction Derby in 1995. Released for the PC and all the home consoles of its era, Destruction Derby allowed players to experience the chaotic thrill of a demolition derby in video game form, complete with a robust physics system that allowed cars to collide and crush each other apart, piece by piece. It wasn't universally beloved, but the way it simulated cars' destructibility was, at the time, second to none. For the next 3 years, Reflections would continue to grow in both catalog and clout, releasing both Destruction Derby 2 in 1996, as well as the monster truck game Thunder Truck Rally in 1998, before announcing in early 1999 that they had been acquired by GT Interactive, the influential publisher of Doom, Quake, and Duke Nukem 3D. As a demolition derby and dirt track racing fan from a young age, Martin Edmondson was more than happy to continue designing games inspired by his passion for cars and their destructive potential. But he also loved them for their speed and aspired to create a game that would take Destruction Derby's mayhem and physics off of the racing tracks and into the streets. An experience that would capture the sense of adrenaline-pumping car chases like those seen in movies such as Bullet, The French Connection, and The Driver. At the time, another British developer by the name of DMA Design had already attracted the interest of car chase enthusiasts with its 1997 action game, Grand Theft Auto. Possessing a top-down view and a devil-may-care attitude, Grand Theft Auto allowed players to engage in all manner of chaos within its two-dimensional cityscapes, including breaking into cars and entering high-octane chases with the police. While Grand Theft Auto and its sequel commanded considerable popularity, both games' distant perspectives prevented their action from evoking a strong sense of immediacy and theatricality. But what if they were made using a similar engine and viewpoint to that of Destruction Derby? The idea was there, and Reflections would waste no time capitalizing on it when in June of 1999, they'd release their most technologically advanced game yet for the original PlayStation, Driver. Driver follows John Tanner, an undercover NYPD officer tasked with investigating the notorious Castaldi family in a funky 70s-inspired rendition of the United States. Infiltrating the criminal underworld as a wheelman for hire, Tanner is ultimately forced to put his pedal to the metal across Miami, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York in his efforts to stop a nefarious scheme orchestrated by the family. Like Grand Theft Auto before it, Driver's cityscapes are dynamic, open-ended, and filled with cars that the player is able to interact with and explore from the confines of their own vehicle. The game also allows players to make full use of the many vehicular techniques at their disposal, from the slalom to the reverse 180 in order to complete Tanner's capers. Once they manage to do so, the player can go back and edit their missions in the game's director mode, which allows them to set up cameras around and record their exploits from whatever angle they so choose. The game also contains a small number of mini-games featuring specialized objectives, including Pursuit, in which the player must follow and destroy a police car, and Survival, where they have to survive as long as possible against an onslaught of cops. Driver would be met with universal acclaim, with many, unsurprisingly, singling out the sublimity of its driving. The physics governing the movement and capabilities of the game's cars were realistic for the time, and provided competitive-oriented players with a sufficiently high skill ceiling. Its control scheme was easy to grasp, and the sensation of crashing into opposing cars was as satisfying as it had been in Destruction Derby, giving the experience an arcade flavor other serious driving games lacked. More importantly, however, even though comparisons to Grand Theft Auto or Destruction Derby remained inevitable, most players agreed that the game's tone and multitude of original concepts, such as its director mode, made it irreducible to either. Driver wasn't just a fully 3D Grand Theft Auto or an open-ended Destruction Derby, it was its own distinct beast. To Reflections, the success of Driver was vindicating. After spending 2.5 years creating one of the earliest games that allowed players to freely explore a three-dimensional in-game city, the studio was happy, if not slightly surprised, to see their brainchild take off as it did, given that it was a new IP and released relatively late in the PlayStation's lifecycle. Some within Reflections were dissatisfied with the way certain aspects of the project had turned out, however, with Gareth Edmondson, Martin Edmondson's brother, revealing to GameSpot in 2006 that they were disappointed with the game's storyline and believed its mission design to be weak because it didn't support its narrative well. But such disappointments were not enough to prevent players from lapping it up. Driver would prove to be an immense commercial success, selling over 6 million copies on the PlayStation alone, and eventually making its way onto PCs, Macs, and even iPhones in the years that would come, with new features and improvements. A 2D adaptation of the title would also release for the Game Boy Color in May of the following year, courtesy of Crawfish Interactive. Despite making various concessions to accommodate for the Game Boy's lesser hardware, the game would be well received. Critics were impressed with how earnestly the title attempted to emulate its console brother's look and feel. Across home consoles and handhelds, Driver had become a name to be reckoned with. After a string of highly lucrative years, GT Interactive had become mired in considerable financial difficulties by 1999. Enough so that even Driver's strong sales were of little help. As a result, both GT and Reflections would end up being acquired in November by Infogrames Entertainment, which had risen to prominence over the preceding decade by acquiring numerous other development studios and their respective intellectual properties, including the rights to Atari's properties and name, which it would prominently rebrand itself with in the early 2000s. While relations between Reflections and their faux Atari owners would eventually become strained over time, the two remained largely cordial during the development of Reflections' final game for the original PlayStation, Driver 2. Released in November of 2000, Driver 2 sees Tanner and a fellow officer named Tobias Jones travel to Chicago, Vegas, Havana, and Rio de Janeiro with the intention of putting an end to a criminal underworld's war. This time around, however, Driver has taken an additional page out of DMA Design's book, with Tanner now being able to enter and exit different cars and explore each city on foot. Joining this change are several other tweaks and additions to the original game's design, such as each city having a larger surface while also being visually and structurally more complex, and the inclusion of a two-player multiplayer mode for some of the package's minigames. While all of these changes carried with them nothing but Reflections' goodwill, Driver 2's reception would be mixed, due in large part to the game's abundance of frame rate issues, unbalanced difficulty, and its out-of-car segments. Though many appreciated the novelty of being able to explore Driver 2's environments on foot, and with it the freedom to access multiple vehicles, most agreed that these segments were just too limited in what they allowed the player to do, and difficult to control. Outside of these sticking points, much of the underlying tissue that made the first game so great still remained. But the consensus was quickly reached that Driver 2 was too ambitious a project for the hardware on which it arrived and the time in which it was produced. Internally, Reflections was pleased with many of the upgrades and enhancements they had made over the first title, with Gareth Edmondson highlighting the game's featured cities and improved story as aspects of the game he was personally satisfied with. However, even he would acknowledge that they had pushed the PlayStation's capabilities a little too much, and that the finished product wasn't all that it could have been as a result. Despite this, the momentum of the first Driver, still fresh in many gamers' minds, helped propel Driver 2 sales-wise, with Atari highlighting the game as a key contributor to the company's strong financial performance during the year of its release. And, like its predecessor, it would be complemented by a solid portable adaptation titled Driver 2 Advance for the Game Boy Advance in October of 2002. Developed by Sonari Interactive, Driver 2 Advance follows in the footsteps of titles like Duke Nukem Advance and Cruisin' Velocity, using a raycasting engine custom-built by Sonari, which allows the player to explore basic, three-dimensional cityscapes in cars or on foot. And rivaling the PlayStation version's two-player multiplayer, Advance allows for up to 4 players to play mini-games with each other using link cables. The game was well received, and critics were impressed with how faithful the title was in emulating its home console counterpart, despite the handheld's technical limitations.
Through the logs and back onto the river.
After the release of Driver 2, Reflections decided to take a break from their vehicular pursuit series and develop 2002's Stuntman, an action racing game for the PlayStation 2 about a Hollywood stunt performer. Featuring a mix of Driver's vehicular mayhem with some intense out-of-car antics, Stuntman would receive accolades for the originality of its premise and mechanics, but criticism for its punishing difficulty. At the very least, fans of Driver unenthused by Stuntman could take solace in knowing that Driver 3 was on the way, with an exclusive teaser for the title included in Stuntman's disc. But even with this knowledge, there was reason to be anxious, because another game with 3 in its title had already stepped into town and stolen some of Driver's thunder, a PlayStation 2 behemoth called Grand Theft Auto 3. For their third entry in their crime series, DMA Design, now known as Rockstar North, had transplanted the design of their first 2 top-down titles into an expansive and fully 3D world, replete with shootouts, car chases, and an endless amount of emergent scenarios thanks to its open-ended design. The game would prove immensely beloved and influential, providing the blueprints for all open-world or sandbox games that would follow. To Reflections, however, Grand Theft Auto 3 represented a fierce riposte. Up until this point, Reflections had repeatedly borrowed elements from Grand Theft Auto and implemented them into Driver, earning their own series greater fame in doing so. Even the handheld Driver games, despite their limited nature, tended to be more favorably received than Grand Theft Auto's portable entries. But now, Rockstar had shot back and trounced Reflection in praise and profits with a game that, while possessing vastly different driving mechanics, absolutely crushed Driver in terms of gameplay possibilities and environmental detail. Rockstar would even go as far as to start openly mocking Driver within their games from this point forward. In a Grand Theft Auto 3 mission titled Two-Faced Tanner, for example, the player is tasked with killing an undercover cop who has a feminine running animation, a reference to Tanner's comparatively awkward walk cycle in Driver 2. Likewise, in the Grand Theft Auto Vice City mission Autoside, the player is tasked with killing another character called Tanner, along with several other NPCs named after characters from SIE London Studios' The Getaway. Overall, the cards were stacked high against Driver 3. Not only did it have to make up for Driver 2's missteps, but it also had to prove the series' worth in a post-Grand Theft Auto 3 world. In the lead-up to Driver 3's release, Reflections stressed that while the game wouldn't ignore the advancements that Rockstar had brought to the open-world genre, the series' third title would be a driving game first and foremost. It would tear more and more pages out of Grand Theft Auto's tome, such as giving players the ability to wield firearms when on foot, and by having its own star-studded list of celebrity voice talent like Michael Madsen, Mickey Rourke, and Iggy Pop. But everything that didn't involve Tanner behind the wheel would play second fiddle. Driving, per the series title, was the game's focus. However, when Driver 3 would finally launch for the PlayStation 2 and Xbox in June of 2004, and later on the PC in March of 2005, it was difficult to see whether Reflections had focused on anything at all.
Kalita, South Beach lead. She moves $80 million a year in stolen guns and cars.
He ain't working for Ticos.
Lomaz, hardware specialist. Gun freak with pimp chic.
You need a driver, and I need a team.
The game's plot provided some enjoyment, and driving still felt solid. But everything else was mercilessly bogged down by a myriad of bugs, glitches, and awkward design choices. The game's AI was questionable at best, the mission design slipshod and inconsistent, and its controls during the on-foot section severely lacking. The game would be lambasted upon its release, with many critics accusing Atari of rushing Reflections to release Driver 3 before it was ready so that the publisher could get ahead of Grand Theft Auto San Andreas' launch later that year. This assertion would end up being proven true, with Atari's sales and marketing VP Nick Fajor admitting at a press event 2 years later that Driver 3 was pushed out the door half-baked for revenue reasons. As if the situation couldn't have been any more painful, Driver 3 would also end up embroiled in a conspiracy known as Drivergate shortly after its launch. Members of the game's radar forums accused two outlets that gave the title unusually high review scores, PlayStation Magazine and Xbox World, of having been paid by Atari to do so, only to find their complaints being systematically deleted. While no concrete evidence would ever emerge that proved the accusations to be true, the debacle did little to help Reflections or Atari's reputation. The tenuous relationship of the two companies would come to a head when Martin Edmondson departed Reflections half a year after Driver 3's release and sued Atari for unfair dismissal shortly thereafter. Like Driver 2, Driver 3 would receive a belated Game Boy Advance adaptation, which would launch in October of the following year to mixed reviews. Created by the two-man development team of Fernando Feliz and Guillaume Dubai, the game wowed players with its impressive 3D graphics, while letting them down with its inconsistent collision detection and awkward combat. In the aftermath of Driver 3, Reflections conducted an extensive post-mortem on the game's production, carefully analyzing everything that had gone into its creation and everything that had been said about it after being put out the door. Reflections wanted to get back in fans' good faith, and after evaluating what had gone wrong with their last title, it was decided that their next game would right Driver 3's wrongs by refining its mixture of open world and driving systems while dropping the scenery and characters from the series' first three titles. The result of these efforts would be 2006's Driver Parallel Lines. Released in March for the PlayStation 2 and Xbox, with ports for the Wii and PC arriving the following year, Parallel Lines follows TK, a getaway driver who becomes entrenched in New York's criminal underworld. Unlike previous titles, Parallel Lines' narrative unfolds entirely in the Big Apple, yet across two time periods, with the first half of the game taking place in 1978 and the second in 2006, after TK is framed for murder and sentenced to prison for the better part of 3 decades. Though this difference in time periods results in the appearance and layout of New York changing, Parallel Lines' core gameplay, a sandbox experience similar to Grand Theft Auto, with the physics and vehicular action of Driver, remains the same throughout. Players' reactions were warm, yet despondent. The glitches and awkwardness that so aggressively characterized Driver 3 were all but smoothed over. The story was solid, and the sensation of blazing through the streets of New York City in a stolen car was second to none. But where this series' previous 3 entries felt at least marginally distinct from Rockstar's Juggernaut series, Parallel Lines made no pretense of having abandoned the iconic staples that characterized the franchise's earliest entries. And, aside from driving, everything it did do well, GTA simply did better. While the negative stigma carried by Driver 3 had been successfully shaken off, the series' identity felt as if it had been lost. For what issues Driver was suffering from at the time, however, Atari was in even direr straits. After years spent aggressively acquiring companies from all over the industry, the French outfit's finances had entered a downward spiral, one that Parallel Lines' middling reception did little to help alleviate. One by one, Atari closed down and sold off all the studios it had amassed, and Reflections would end up being purchased by Ubisoft in August of 2006. Ubisoft was at this point well on its way to becoming the giant that it is today, and saw Driver as a means of gaining a foothold in the driving games market, where it still lacked a strong presence. The acquisition would be followed up in May of 2007 with the release of 2 new Driver titles for portable devices. The first would be Driver LA Undercover, a Gameloft-developed mobile game that sees Tanner take on the Mafia in the City of Angels. Mechanically and visually similar to Gameloft's own Asphalt series, the game would receive mixed reviews. The second would be Driver 76 for the PlayStation Portable. Developed jointly by Reflections and Sumo Digital, 76 serves as a prequel to Parallel Lines, following TK's childhood friend Ray as he takes down a criminal empire to win the affection of his flame in another Grand Theft Auto-like romp. Once again, mixed opinions abounded. 76's driving felt as great as ever, and the game's cutscenes, which used comic book-style illustrations to relay the game's narrative, proved popular. But its drab environments, poor enemy AI, and short length left critics less than satisfied. Like Parallel Lines before it, 76 was neither as bad as Driver 3, nor did it present a particularly seductive vision of the series' future. And with Grand Theft Auto Liberty City Stories and Vice City Stories having already been released for the PlayStation Portable in years prior, it couldn't claim to offer a unique experience even within the confines of Sony's handheld platform. Fortunately, plans were already underway at Reflections to try and steer the series back to its former stardom.
I've driven the streets of 100 cities to catch criminals. But Jericho is a different beast. I've always sworn I'd drive to hell and back to take him down. Looks like I just got my chance.
I got hold of the Amiga reference manual.
Shortly after acquiring Reflections, Ubisoft brought Martin Edmondson back on board to oversee the studio's next home console release. Unlike Atari, Ubisoft made it clear early on that they wanted Reflections project to receive whatever resources it needed to be a hit, and that they wouldn't force the studio to release the game until it was ready. Inspired by the extent to which Ubisoft seemed to care for and understand their craft, production began at Reflections on a Driver game that would attempt to resolve the series' fractured identity. Doing so meant addressing many complicated issues that had built up along the series' rim over the years, including, most significantly, the series' on-foot sections. Being able to exit and enter new vehicles was novel and useful back in the days of Driver 2, but it always felt off and resulted in the series being compared more to Grand Theft Auto than Reflections wanted it to. The studio desired a return to the glory days of the original Driver, and that meant the player's ability to get out of vehicles and walk around needed to go. But how would they retain the game's freedom to switch cars on the fly if they didn't want the player to physically exit them? The answer would be a concept conceived early on that the team called Google Earth Live. whereby the player would be able to zoom out any time to a comprehensive top-down map of their environment and enter whatever vehicle struck their fancy. Creating the technology that allowed Reflections to implement such a system would take a great deal of time and effort. But when Driver San Francisco, Reflections' Google Earth opus, would finally release in September of 2011 for the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, PC, and Wii, most consumers agreed that this time and effort had been well spent. Driver San Francisco brings Tanner back into the fold as the series protagonist, albeit in a very different manner than any prior title in the series. After a devastating crash puts him in a coma, Tanner discovers that he can survey his surroundings from a top-down view and shift his consciousness into other people's bodies, allowing him to take control over whatever car they're driving at a moment's notice. What unfolds is a narrative that sees Tanner attempt to make the most of his ability in order to foil a plot hatched by his arch-nemesis, Jericho, and understand the nature behind his strange predicament. The game also features the return of Director Mode, which was absent from Parallel Lines, and, in a first for the series, San Francisco allows for online play across a host of competitive multiplayer modes. The Wii version of San Francisco, on the other hand, serves as a prequel to the entire series, following Tanner in the city by the bay during his rookie years as an undercover cop. As a result of the Wii's lesser hardware, the game lacks its HD counterpart's shift mechanic. In its place, the player can get a leg up on their adversaries by shooting them with the Wii remote, and entering a slow-motion mode to make difficult maneuvers. The response to San Francisco's high-definition version would be ecstatic, with players unanimously praiseful of the uniqueness and depth of the shift mechanic, as well as all of the varied gameplay scenarios it made possible over the course of its narrative. Also positively received was the game's humoristic tone and dialogue. While a major tonal shift from previous entries, many felt it provided the game with a unique and entertaining feel that stopped short of descending into self-parody.
Great stuff! Good lesson! Now, pull over on the right here, please, Craig.
There's still time on the clock, and I want my money's worth.
Please! I'm too young! Inside! I'm still young!
The Wii version, on the other hand, would receive a less enthusiastic reaction, with critics disappointed by its simpler design and control issues. But in a year when most other third-party developers' efforts on the Wii were either exploitative cash grabs or non-existent, it was an unexpected breath of fresh air. And more importantly, both it and its HD counterparts' design firmly rebuffed the series' previous closeness to Grand Theft Auto. For the first time in years, the Driver series felt like its own beast again, and not just an imitator living in the shadow of a monolith. Internally, however, Reflections' own assessment of the game was Pyrrhic. The studio was immensely proud of their latest opus, but the challenges of rebooting Driver had taken 5 rough years, filled with layoffs, delays, and direction changes. And though San Francisco would perform decently at retail, it would fall short of covering the cost of its development. Despite succeeding so strongly in players' eyes, Reflections almost felt as if they had failed. Like prior Driver games, San Francisco would be complemented by a small flurry of portable entries, with both a mobile version of San Francisco, similar in style to LA Undercover, and a 3DS game titled Driver Renegade 3D, releasing the same month as their console cousins. Developed by the same two-man team that made Driver 3's portable version, Renegade takes place in between the events of Driver 1 and 2, chronicling Tanner's attempts to continue cleaning up crime in the streets of New York. Sadly, the novelty of being able to explore the Big Apple in stereoscopic 3D would not be enough to assuage the game's critics, who felt the game's objectives to be repetitive and lacking in challenge, and its environments overly bland.
Fragged! Goodbye forever, asshole.
After 2011, the Driver franchise would go quiet, with only scant life signs reminding players of its existence. In late 2013, Ubisoft North American president Laurent Detac would explain that the engine used in the open-world game Watch Dogs was originally built for a project that might have become a Driver game. The title saw some progress, but much like how Rainbow Six Patriots metamorphosed into Rainbow Six Siege, the changing tides of the video game industry led it to being scrapped so that Watch Dogs could take its place. Then in December of 2014, Ubisoft Paris would release Driver Speedboat Paradise for iPhone and Android. A free-to-play racing game with in-app purchases, Speedboat Paradise sees the player, a nameless rising star within the speedboat scene, take on the unironically named Powerboat Mafia by competing against them on the ocean waves. The game would receive a cold reception upon its reveal, with many upset to see a driver name slapped willy-nilly onto what seemed an incredibly generic boat racing game. And those who would go on to play the title were hard-pressed to find anything positive about it. Well, one might assume that Driver San Francisco's modest success made Ubisoft apprehensive of greenlighting a new mainline Driver title. The reality simply seems to be that passions have shifted at the development teams most equipped to make it. After burning themselves out making San Francisco, Reflections decided to reorganize their operations, shifting from a studio that based its entire livelihood on a single product of their own creation, to a studio that handles multiple projects of other studios' design. Instead of releasing new destruction derbies or drivers once every few years, Reflections has worked in a supporting role on most of Ubisoft's tentpole releases since 2011, helping implement vehicles and titles that prominently feature driving, such as Ghost Recon Wildlands and Watch Dogs 2, and playing a large part in the overall development of series like The Division and The Crew. Their involvement on the latter title is most notable, as both The Crew and its sequel, similar to Driver San Francisco's Google Earth-inspired teleportation, allow the player to instantaneously fast travel around the map via a satellite view. Amidst these AAA-scale projects, a small internal team continues to produce original indie game-inspired content, such as 2015's Grow Home or 2017's At Omega. But for the most part, Reflections occupies second billing on the projects they develop. As explained to MCV in 2016 by Reflections Managing Director Pauline Jackie, the English company has found a satisfying junction in which to exist. Even though their contributions to Watch Dogs or The Crew won't be as well known as those of the studios that originated these titles, the team is satisfied knowing that they left a mark on the game that is unmistakably theirs. And because they don't have the pressure that comes with leading such massive projects, they've benefited from a stronger and less constrained work ethic. When asked whether a new Driver title was in the cards, Jackie responded by stating that if they wanted to develop one, they could and they would. Nobody at Ubisoft is preventing them, and they've come to terms with the fact that San Francisco wasn't a failure. They just don't have any interest in rebooting the franchise. Reflections may no longer possess the passion they once had for Driver, but the lessons it learned developing the series has allowed the studio to elevate the rest of Ubisoft's portfolio. Hopefully, this talent will one day mix with the same impulse that drives original titles like Grow Home. And Reflections will give John Tanner one more ride. Our documentaries are crowdfunded and made possible by the generous supporters backing us on Patreon. If you enjoy our content, consider subscribing to our channel and becoming a patron to help us create more. Thank you.